Hello there, my peaceful dreamers. I have been working on something behind the scenes that I am so excited about. And next week, I finally get to share it with all of you. So make sure you are following the channel. You will not want to miss this one. So, tonight, we tell the story of Jasper's constant nightmare. We step away from love stories and golden eyes, and we follow the one member of the Cullen family who carries what no one else can even feel. A soldier. An empath. A man who walks into every room already holding the weight of everyone inside it, and who never once lets it show. If there is a Twilight story you would love to fall asleep to next, tell me in the comments. I would love to create it for you. Get cozy. Find your position. And let Jasper's world carry you somewhere quiet and deep. Jasper Whitlock was born in 1844 in the state of Texas. And from the very beginning, he was the kind of person other people instinctively moved toward. It was not simply that he was handsome, though he was, or that he was articulate, though he was that too. It was something less definable, a quality in the way he listened, in the way he seemed to understand what a person needed before that person had fully understood it themselves. He had a gift for making others feel seen, not through any particular act of generosity or deliberate effort, but through presence alone. He simply noticed people in a way that most others did not, and people felt it without being able to explain why. A nervous man steadied himself in Jasper's company without understanding why he had steadied. A grieving woman found that her grief sat more quietly when Jasper was nearby, as though something in the air around him offered a kind of permission to breathe. Children trusted him on sight. Animals were calm around him. Even people who had reason to be guarded found their guardedness dissolving before they had consciously decided to lower it. In another life, in a longer one, this quality might have made him a counselor, a diplomat, a leader of the kind that history occasionally produces and never quite knows what to do with once it has produced them. In the life he was given, it made him a soldier, and then something far older and far stranger than a soldier. He grew up in a Texas that was still finding its edges, a state barely 2 decades removed from its own independence, still raw with the particular energy of a place that has recently decided what it is. His family was respectable without being wealthy, the kind of household where hard work was understood as a moral position rather than simply a practical necessity. His father was a man of few words and consistent principles, the kind of father whose approval was not easily given and therefore genuinely valued when it arrived. His mother was warmer, quicker to laugh, the one who noticed when something was wrong, before anyone had said anything was wrong. Jasper inherited something from each of them, from his father, the discipline and the silence and the capacity to function under pressure without losing composure. From his mother, the attention to the emotional life of the people around him, the instinct to feel his way through a room before he thought his way through it. He was the kind of boy who resolved disputes between other boys without needing to raise his voice, who could talk a frightened horse down from a panic with a steadiness that the animal seemed to recognize as genuine rather than performed, who sat with his younger siblings during thunderstorms, not because they asked him to, but because he always seemed to know before they said anything that they needed him there. He enlisted in the Confederate Army in 1861. He was 16 years old. He told the recruiting officers he was 20, and they believed him without difficulty because Jasper Whitlock carried himself with a kind of settled certainty that most men do not develop until they are well into their 30s. There was nothing of the boy in the way he stood, in the way he met a person's eyes, in the quiet confidence with which he spoke. He was not performing adulthood. He had simply arrived at it early, or perhaps had never fully inhabited the unsteadiness that was supposed to come before it. The officers looked at him and saw someone they would follow, which was the same thing other people had always seen when they looked at Jasper Whitlock, and they signed him without further question. He rose through the ranks with a speed that surprised even his most experienced superior officers. By 1863, he had been made a major in the Confederate cavalry, one of the youngest men to hold that rank in the history of that particular conflict. His soldiers followed him without question, not because he demanded it, but because he inspired something in them that went beyond duty or obligation or the simple mathematics of military hierarchy. They trusted him. They felt steadier in his presence. They could not explain it and did not try to, because soldiers in wartime have very little energy to spend on explanations. They simply noted that things went better when Major Whitlock was present, and they attached themselves to that fact the way men in difficult circumstances attach themselves to anything reliable. What neither Jasper nor anyone around him understood at the time was that his gift for reading people was not merely intuition or emotional intelligence refined by practice and attention. It was something more literal, more physiological, more extraordinary than any word available to him in 1863 could have accurately described. He was sensing the emotional states of those around him in a way that went far beyond what human perception should have allowed. He felt the fear of his men before they showed it. He felt the confidence of an enemy before the charge revealed it. He knew when a room was about to turn, before anything visible in that room had changed. He knew when a negotiation was failing before the other party had said anything that should have indicated failure. He knew when someone was lying, not because he caught the small tells that experienced observers learn to read, but because the emotional signature of dishonesty was distinct from the emotional signature of truth, and his body registered that distinction with the same involuntary certainty with which other people register temperature or sound. He had always assumed this was simply what it felt like to be perceptive. He had no frame of reference for anything else, and so he filed the information away under the heading of instinct and went on with the business of being a soldier in a war that was beginning to turn in directions that none of them could fully see yet. In the spring of 1863, Jasper received orders to evacuate civilians from the city of Galveston ahead of a Union advance that was widely expected, but difficult to predict precisely. It was not a combat assignment, and part of him chafed at it quietly. The restlessness of a young officer who had come to understand himself through the discipline and clarity of battle, and who found civilian logistics comparatively formless. The edges of the task always shifting, the measure of success always subjective. But he carried out the order with his characteristic thoroughness, organizing the movement of families southward along roads that were growing increasingly uncertain as the war shifted the landscape around them, making decisions quickly, keeping the movement orderly, using his gift without naming it to keep the fear of the civilians he was leading from tipping into panic. It was late in the evening when he encountered them. 3 women standing in the road. Later, when Jasper tried to reconstruct the logic of that meeting, he found very little logic to reconstruct. He had been on horseback. He had been armed. He was an experienced soldier in a time and place where encountering strangers on a road after dark was a reasonable cause for caution. And caution was something Jasper Whitlock was very good at. And yet, looking back across the impossible distance of his subsequent existence, he could identify the precise moment when all of that caution had simply dissolved, replaced by something that felt like ease, like rightness, like the particular comfort of arriving somewhere you had not known you were heading toward. He remembered dismounting. He remembered that the night was very still. He remembered the way the 3 women looked at him, the quality of attention in their eyes that was unlike the quality of attention in the eyes of any person he had encountered before, though he would not understand why until much later. The 3 women were vampires. Their names were Maria, Lucy, and Nettie, and they had been moving through a landscape made conveniently chaotic by human conflict, as vampires throughout history have moved through human chaos, finding in disruption and displacement the particular freedoms that ordinary peacetime denies them. When they saw Jasper on that road, Maria made a decision with the speed and certainty of someone who has had centuries of practice making exactly this kind of assessment. She looked at him and saw his bearing, his composure, the particular quality of his attention, and she understood before he had said more than a few words that he was exceptional, that he was in fact precisely the kind of exceptional that she needed. She was not wrong. She was simply not thinking about what it would cost him, because the cost was his to pay, and she had never been particularly interested in accounting for what she extracted from others. The encounter moved quickly after that first assessment, though Jasper did not experience it as quick. He felt the pull of the 3 women in the way a compass feels the pull of north, an inexplicable orientation towards something his body was registering before his mind could evaluate it. He was not afraid. He should have been afraid. He was not. And that absence of fear should itself have been a warning, but it wasn't, because the calm he felt was not entirely his own. Maria was projecting it deliberately. She was good at that. She had been doing it for a very long time. Maria bit him first. The others followed. He did not understand what was happening as it began. The blood left his body faster than seemed possible, and the darkness that followed it was not the darkness of sleep or unconsciousness, but of something more complete. A withdrawal from every familiar thing simultaneously, the ground and the night and the sound of the road and his own name all receding together into a distance that felt absolute. And then the fire started. Every person who has experienced the vampire transformation describes it the same way, reaching across whatever language they were born into for the same word, because it is the only word that is accurate. Fire, not heat as metaphor, not the language of intensity used by someone trying to communicate something that is technically different from burning. Actual fire, the unmistakable, specific, precise sensation of burning from the inside out, of every vein becoming a channel for something that moved through the body with terrible thoroughness, that paused for nothing, that left nothing unchanged in its passage. It traveled his circulatory system like it knew the map of him, following every pathway with patient, excruciating attention. And where it went, it rewrote what it found. Cells that had been human became something else. Nerves that had processed the world at human speeds were restructured for something faster and more absolute. Tissue that had been soft and vulnerable and mortal was replaced slowly and agonizingly with something that would not age and would not soften and would not yield. Jasper had been on battlefields. He had seen what violence did to the human body and had managed his own physical suffering through the soldier's practiced method of reducing pain to something categorizable, something that could be placed in a specific location and therefore in some sense contained. The transformation offered him no such structure. It could not be located because it was everywhere. It could not be categorized because it was everything. It was simply all of him, burning for 3 days without a single moment of relief or diminishment. And the only available response was to remain inside it, because there was nowhere else to go. On the other side of those 3 days, Jasper opened his eyes, and the world was extraordinary. That was the first and most immediate impression, before fear or confusion or any more complicated response could form. The world was extraordinary. The dark road where he lay resolved into perfect, specific detail, without any light source he could identify as responsible for it. Every texture of the ground beneath him was distinct. The trees at the edge of his vision were individual in a way that trees had never been before, each one separate and precisely rendered, every branch and leaf and variation in the bark visible with a clarity that human eyes were not designed to achieve. The air was dense with information, layers of scent carrying data about the environment around him that he could not yet read fluently, but that his body was already beginning to interpret, already sorting into categories of near and far, living and not living, known and unknown. He sat up without effort, without the stiffness of immobility, without the weakness of recovery, without any of the physical aftermath that should have followed 3 days of whatever had just happened to him. His body responded instantly, completely, with a readiness that felt less like returning to health and more like being introduced to a version of himself that had always been waiting behind the one he had occupied before. Maria was there, watching him with that quality of attention he now understood differently than he had on the road 3 evenings ago. And then his gift arrived in his new form, and everything else became secondary. He had always felt the emotions of those around him. He had lived with this his entire life, and had understood it as sensitivity, as perception, as something that lived at the furthest edge of ordinary human experience without quite exceeding it. But what arrived in the first moments of his new existence was not perception. It was not sensitivity. It was reception, total and immediate and indiscriminate. The emotional states of Maria and the others present not as impressions, but as full experiences arriving in his nervous system with the same weight and immediacy as his own feelings, indistinguishable at first from whatever he himself was experiencing. Maria's satisfaction flooded into him before she had moved or spoken. It was not an impression of her satisfaction. It was satisfaction felt in his own chest, settling behind his sternum with the specific quality of someone who has just acquired something they have been looking for. He knew, before she said a single word, exactly what she thought of him. He knew the shape of her ambition and the temperature of her approval, and the precise nature of what she intended to do with him. He had felt echoes of this his entire human life, small and manageable and easy to mistake for intuition. What he felt now was the full version of what his gift had always been reaching toward, and it was enormous, and it was going to cost him in ways he could not yet begin to calculate. Maria explained the world to him in the hours that followed. What he was, what they were. The thirst, which was already burning in his throat with an intensity that demanded all of his attention and received only part of it, because the rest was occupied with managing the inflow of everyone else's emotional state. The strength and the speed and the permanence of transformation. The wars being fought across the south between vampire factions competing for territory and dominance. Her army of newborns. The system she had built and the role she had designed for him within it. Jasper listened carefully, the way he had always listened, assembling the picture of what his existence was now going to contain. He did not yet know what it would cost him. He did not know that the gift which had made him exceptional as a human had followed him into this new existence and expanded there into something of an entirely different and far more punishing magnitude. He did not know that the thirst already burning in his throat was an emotional state as much as a physical one, and that he would feel it not only from within himself, but from every vampire around him, layered and amplified and completely impossible to separate from his own want. He did not know that Maria had not simply recruited a soldier. She had recruited someone who would spend the next several decades absorbing everyone else's hunger as his own, managing everyone else's violence as his own, carrying the accumulated emotional weight of an army in constant conflict as his own, and calling all of it duty because he did not yet have the language to call it anything else, and because the alternative to duty was despair, and despair was a door Jasper Whitlock had not yet learned to open. But all of that was coming. The wars were coming. The newborns and the blood and the decades of beautiful, brutal, unrelenting noise were coming. For now, in the first quiet hours of his immortal life, Jasper sat in the darkened Texas and felt the world press in on him from every direction, vivid and vast and overwhelming, and he mistook it for clarity. He would not make that mistake for long. The world Jasper entered was not the world he had been recruited for. Maria had described it to him in terms of strategy and dominance, of territory claimed and defended, of an ongoing conflict between vampire factions that had been reshaping the landscape of the American South for decades before he had arrived in it. She had spoken of it the way experienced commanders speak of war to new officers, with the clean language of objectives and outcomes, with the careful omission of everything that does not serve the purpose of making the new recruit feel that the thing they are being asked to do is manageable. It was not manageable. Not for Jasper. The first newborn Maria created after his transformation was a young man named Hector, who had been a farmhand outside of Monterey, and who woke from his 3 days of burning with the particular quality of chaos that characterized all newborns in their earliest weeks. He was enormous in his hunger and his confusion, and his inability to distinguish between the two. He could not understand what had happened to him. He could not understand the thirst that consumed every other thought before it had fully formed. He could not understand why his own body felt like a foreign country, vast and powerful and completely ungoverned, responding to stimuli with a speed and force that he had no framework for managing. Jasper felt all of it, not as observation, not as the sympathetic awareness of someone watching another person struggle. He felt Hector's confusion as confusion in his own mind, arriving without warning and without label, indistinguishable for the first disorienting seconds from his own interior state. He felt the newborn's thirst layered directly on top of his own, doubling it, and then felt Hector's panic at the thirst doubling it again. A feedback loop of want and fear and overwhelming physical demand that hit Jasper's nervous system like a wave hitting something that was not built to be a seawall. He stood very still and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and because stillness was the only strategy available to him in that moment. He breathed through it. He separated, with enormous effort, what was his from what was Hector's, drawing the line between his own emotional state and the one bleeding into him from outside. It took longer than it should have. It was harder than it should have been. And when he had finally achieved some version of that separation, when he had constructed something resembling a boundary between himself and the newborn's chaos, he understood with quiet and terrible clarity that this was going to be the work of his existence in Maria's army. Not the fighting, not the strategy, not even the killing, though the killing would come. The work was going to be this constant, effortful, invisible labor of sorting himself from everyone around him, of maintaining the boundary between his own experience and the experience of every other emotional being in his vicinity, of functioning as a soldier and a commander and a rational actor in a world that was pouring itself into him without pause or permission. Maria created more newborns. She was efficient about it, moving through the human population of the border regions with a practiced selectivity, choosing for size and health and whatever quality she had learned to recognize as the marker of a vampire who would be useful rather than simply chaotic. Each new creation expanded the emotional field that Jasper was required to navigate. 2 newborns became 5. 5 became 12. 12 became the foundation of what Maria intended to be a fighting force, capable of holding and expanding her territory against the other factions pressing in from the north and east. Each one of them was a source. Each one broadcast their emotional state into the air around them with the unguarded intensity of someone who has no idea they are broadcasting. Because newborn vampires have no awareness of anything beyond their own immediate experience. And their immediate experience is almost entirely composed of thirst and confusion and the specific terror of not understanding what they have become. Jasper absorbed all of it. The thirst alone was extraordinary in its volume. A single vampire's thirst was already an intense emotional state, already something that occupied a significant portion of the mind's attention, regardless of how long the vampire had been practicing control. multiplied across 12 bodies, all of them in the earliest and most uncontrolled weeks of their new existence, all of them broadcasting that hunger with the full force of newly enhanced emotional capacity. The thirst that Jasper experienced on any given day in Maria's camp was not his own hunger plus theirs. It was something larger and less navigable than simple addition suggested, a compound sensation that did not resolve into discrete components but merged into a single overwhelming pressure that lived in his throat and his chest and the back of his skull simultaneously. He trained them anyway. This was what Maria required of him, and he was still, beneath everything that was being done to him and everything he was being asked to do, fundamentally a soldier. He understood orders. He understood the structure of command and the responsibility that came with it. He could take 12 newborns who were barely capable of coherent thought and begin the process of teaching them to function, to follow instruction, to direct the enormous and ungoverned force of their new bodies towards specific objectives, rather than simply releasing it in all directions at once. He was good at it, exceptionally good at it, for reasons that should by now be unsurprising. He could feel what the newborns felt, which meant he understood their struggles not as an outside observer trying to interpret behavior, but as someone experiencing a version of those struggles from the inside. He knew when a newborn was approaching the edge of control before any external sign appeared, because the emotional signature of imminent loss of control had a specific quality that his gift registered clearly. He could intervene at precisely the right moment, with the right tone and the right approach, because he always knew what was actually happening inside the person he was working with, rather than having to guess at it from the surface. He also used his gift actively, projecting calm into the training environment the way a conductor shapes the sound of an orchestra, dampening the worst of the emotional chaos, introducing steadiness where there was none, creating the conditions in which the newborns could actually hear his instructions rather than being entirely consumed by their own internal noise. This cost him something each time he did it. Projecting an emotional state outward required him to generate it himself, or something close to it, and doing so while simultaneously absorbing the emotional chaos of 12 newborns was a particular kind of exhaustion that had no name because no one else had ever needed to name it. He did not mention this to Maria. She would not have been interested, and he understood that clearly from the first weeks of his existence in her service. Maria's interest in Jasper was the interest of someone who has acquired a valuable instrument. She cared about what he could do. She cared about the results he produced, the newborns he trained, the battles he won, the territory he held. What it cost him to produce those results was not part of her accounting, and he learned quickly that raising the subject would only create a version of concern in her that was entirely strategic, a question of whether his capacity was being maintained at optimal levels, rather than anything resembling genuine regard for his experience. He kept his own counsel and went on with the work. The battles were their own kind of education. Maria's army fought regularly, moving against competing factions with a tactical precision that Jasper helped to develop, and that his gift helped to execute with unusual effectiveness. In a fight between vampires, where speed and strength were relatively equal, information became the decisive advantage. Jasper had more information than anyone else on the field, because he could feel the intentions of the enemy before those intentions had translated into movement. He knew which fighter was about to commit and which was fainting. He knew where the fear was concentrated and where the confidence was. And he knew that concentrated fear in a fighting force was the precursor to collapse just as reliably as concentrated confidence was the precursor to an aggressive push. He used all of this because he was a soldier, and this was the use to which a soldier puts his capabilities. He won fights that should not have been winnable, held ground that should not have been holdable, and brought Maria's army through conflicts that lesser commanders would have lost at significant cost. And through every moment of every battle, he felt not only his own physical experience of the fighting, but the emotional experience of everyone around him, friend and enemy alike. The surge of adrenaline that vampires did not technically possess, but whose emotional equivalent was entirely real. The fury and the fear and the desperate animal focus of creatures fighting for survival. He felt the deaths. This was the part of it that accumulated in ways the fighting itself did not. When a newborn on either side of the conflict was destroyed, there was a moment, sometimes very brief and sometimes not brief at all, in which the dying vampire's emotional state reached a final intensity. Fear, almost always. Sometimes confusion. Sometimes something that was almost relief. In those who had been suffering for long enough that destruction felt like resolution rather than loss. Jasper felt these moments with the full weight of his gift, absorbing each one before the source disappeared entirely, and the absorption left something behind. Not a scar exactly, not a memory in the conventional sense. Something more like a residue, a faint additional weight added to everything else he was already carrying. Over months, and then years, the residue accumulated. Maria ordered the culling of newborns when they aged past their period of peak usefulness, typically somewhere between 1 and 2 years after transformation. The overwhelming strength of the newborn phase diminished as a vampire matured, and Maria had determined long ago that the cost of maintaining older vampires outweighed the benefit they provided. It was a coldly logical calculation, and it was Jasper's responsibility to carry it out. He executed these orders with the same disciplined efficiency he brought to everything else in Maria's service, because the alternative was to refuse, and refusing was not something the architecture of his situation permitted. But executing the order required him to be present in the moments before each death, required him to be close enough to do what needed to be done. And being close enough meant feeling what the newborn being culled was feeling in those final moments with complete and unavoidable clarity. They were afraid. They were almost always afraid. Even the ones who did not show it on the surface. Even the ones who faced what was coming with something that looked like composure from the outside. Jasper felt the truth beneath the composure, the fear that lived underneath whatever presentation they managed, and he felt it as his own fear, arriving in his chest with the full weight of genuine terror before draining away once the source was gone. He carried hundreds of these moments. He carried them forward through the years of Maria's service, the way a person carries a physical burden, invisibly and without acknowledgement, because no one around him understood what he was carrying, or that he was carrying anything at all. To the other members of Maria's operation, Jasper was the commander. Effective, controlled, reliable, the one who could be counted on to do what was required without emotional complication getting in the way. The irony of this perception was so complete that Jasper had stopped finding anything dark or amusing in it long before the years began to blur together. His relationship with Maria remained functional and opaque. She was not cruel to him in any direct sense, not deliberately unkind, not interested in causing him suffering for its own sake. She was simply indifferent to the interior life of the instrument she was using, and that indifference, sustained over years, produced its own particular kind of damage. He had been transformed by her, which meant she occupied a specific position in his existence that was difficult to categorize in ordinary terms. Not family exactly, though the bond of transformation had a quality of permanence that family relationships often did not. Not captor exactly, though his freedom was entirely theoretical. Something in between, a relationship defined by obligation and utility on both sides, warm enough to function and cold enough to clarify. He began to understand, slowly and without any single moment of revelation, that she would never release him willingly, that the role she had designed for him was intended to be permanent, because what he provided was irreplaceable. There was no one else who could do what he did. No one else who could feel the battlefield from the inside, who could manage a room full of unstable newborns by absorbing their chaos and returning calm, who could know before the enemy moved what the enemy was about to do. She needed him too much to let him go. And so the years passed in the Southern Wars, and Jasper Whitlock, who had been a 16-year-old boy with a gift for making people feel steady, became something harder and more worn and increasingly distant from whatever he might have been if the road outside Galveston had been empty that spring evening in 1863. He was not broken. That is important to understand. He was not destroyed by what the years asked of him, not collapsed into something that had given up on the possibility of existing differently. Somewhere underneath the weight of everything he was absorbing, underneath the accumulated residue of years of borrowed fear and borrowed hunger and borrowed death, the essential Jasper remained intact, quieter than it had been, more careful, more accustomed to functioning at a distance from its own interior experience, having learned that getting too close to what he actually felt about any of this was not a luxury that his situation permitted, but intact, still there, still capable, though he did not yet know it, of choosing something other than what had been chosen for him. That possibility was still years away. First, there was more war. There was always more war. Peter arrived in Maria's camp the way most newborns arrived, which is to say badly. He was disoriented and ravenous, and possessed of the particular wild energy that characterized the earliest weeks of vampire existence. That overwhelming surplus of strength and speed and sensation that had nowhere useful to go, and therefore went everywhere at once. He was tall, fair-haired, with a quality even in his chaos that suggested someone who had been, in his human life, accustomed to taking up space without apology. Maria assessed him with the swift efficiency she brought to all new acquisitions and determined that he had potential. She assigned him to Jasper's training cohort and returned her attention to the larger strategic concerns that occupied most of her awareness. Jasper assessed Peter differently. He felt what was underneath the newborn chaos, beneath the hunger and the disorientation and the barely managed physicality of someone who had not yet learned to inhabit their own transformed body. Underneath all of that, Peter had a quality that was genuinely unusual among the newborns Jasper had trained over the years. He had curiosity, not the frantic, unfocused attention that all newborns displayed in their earliest weeks, turning toward every stimulus with the same undifferentiated intensity. Something more directed than that. A genuine interest in understanding his situation rather than simply surviving it. A quality of mind that kept reasserting itself even through the fog of thirst and confusion. Jasper noted it without giving it too much weight, because noting things was something he did constantly and automatically, and because the history of Maria's operation had taught him the specific cost of becoming attached to newborns whose survival was not guaranteed. The training proceeded. Peter was difficult in the ways that newborns with strong personalities were always difficult, resistant to instruction on instinct before becoming capable of recognizing that the instruction was useful. But he learned faster than most. He retained what he was taught, and he was funny, in a dry, observational way that occasionally broke through even the grim functional atmosphere of Maria's camp, making remarks that caught Jasper off guard because they were accurate, and because accuracy delivered with that particular likeness was something Jasper had not encountered in a very long time. He trained Peter for months. He watched him stabilize, watched the worst of the newborn chaos recede as the first year of his existence progressed, watched him develop the beginnings of real control. And he felt, with his gift, the specific texture of Peter's emotional development over that period, the gradual emergence of a more settled interior landscape as the overwhelming noise of the newborn phase began to quiet. Peter became, over those months, someone Jasper recognized in the fuller sense of that word, not just a name assigned to a set of capabilities to be evaluated and directed. A person with a specific way of experiencing the world, with feelings that had shape and consistency and were recognizably his own rather than just the generic chaos of transformation. This was the danger of Jasper's gift, the aspect of it that caused him the most trouble over the years of his service to Maria. He could not maintain the professional distance that his role required without also maintaining a kind of deliberate emotional blindness, a willful refusal to fully process what his gift was telling him about the people he was responsible for. Most of the time he managed this. Most of the time he kept the information at a level of resolution that allowed him to function without being paralyzed by the implications of what he knew. But occasionally, with certain people, the resolution became too high, the information too specific, and the person on the other side of it became too real to be maintained at the necessary distance. Peter was one of those people. When the order came, Jasper already knew what it would be before Maria had finished speaking. He had known it was coming for weeks, had felt it approaching with a particular dread of someone who can see a thing before it arrives and cannot stop its arrival. Peter had been in Maria's service for just over a year. He had aged past the period of peak newborn strength. He was, by the logic of Maria's operation, no longer worth the resources his continued existence required. The calculation was simple and had been made many times before, and the outcome of the calculation was always the same. Maria gave the order with the same efficient brevity she brought to all operational decisions. The words themselves were few. The weight of them was not. Jasper went to where Peter was. Peter looked at him when he arrived. and in his expression there was something that Jasper had not seen in the face of someone facing this particular moment before. Not pure fear, though the fear was there and Jasper felt it clearly. A sharp spike of it that translated directly into his own chest with the usual unwelcome immediacy. But underneath the fear, something else. Clarity. A settled, specific quality of attention that was the emotional signature of someone who has made a decision rather than someone who is simply receiving one. Peter spoke to him, not the way newborns facing destruction usually spoke, which was with desperation or pleading or the kind of raw panic that bypassed language entirely and expressed itself as sound rather than meaning. Peter spoke to Jasper the way a person speaks to another person, directly and without performance, using his name, which itself was unusual enough to register as a disruption in the pattern of how these moments had always gone before. He spoke about what he intended to do. He spoke without aggression and without apology, simply stating the fact of his intention with a calm that was not resignation, but something closer to conviction. He had someone, a female newborn named Charlotte, who had been created by a rival faction, and who Peter had encountered during one of the border conflicts, and who, against all operational logic, he intended to leave with. The emotional field around Peter in that moment was unlike anything Jasper had absorbed from someone in Peter's position before. Underneath the fear was certainty. Underneath the certainty was something warmer and more complicated. The particular emotional signature of someone acting for a reason that mattered to them beyond their own survival. A feeling that Jasper had not had cause to encounter in this particular context, and that landed in his nervous system with an impact that was disproportionate to the words that were carrying it. He stood very still. The calculus of the moment was not complicated on the surface. Maria's order was clear. Jasper's role was clear. He had carried out this same function many times before, and the machinery of it was well established, requiring very little conscious engagement from him at this point. He could do what Maria had told him to do, and Peter would be gone within seconds, and the moment would pass the way all the other moments had passed, leaving behind their small additional weight of residue to be carried forward into the next day and the next order and the years that stretched ahead in Maria's service. He let Peter go. The decision arrived without announcement and without the kind of extended deliberation that would have suggested it was anything other than what it was, which was instinct. Not the hunting instinct, not the predator's instinct that had governed so much of his existence since the road outside Galveston. Something older than that, or perhaps something that had been present before any of it. Something that belonged to the boy in Texas who had sat with frightened siblings and talked horses down from panic and known, without being told, when someone needed him to simply stand aside. Peter took Charlotte and disappeared into the darkness, and Jasper stood in the place where they had been and said nothing to anyone about what had just happened, and Maria did not learn of it until later, and by then there was nothing to be done. He told himself various things about why he had made the decision he had made in the hours and days that followed. He told himself it was a strategic calculation, that Peter had shown unusual capability, and that destroying him was a waste of resources. He told himself it was an error of attention, a momentary lapse in the operational discipline that had otherwise characterized his service. He told himself many things that were plausible enough to function as explanations, and none of which were the actual explanation. The actual explanation was that he had felt the truth of what Peter was feeling in that moment, the specific quality of a person acting from genuine love rather than self-interest, and that truth had been more persuasive than the order he had been given. And for the first time in his existence in Maria's service, he had let something other than her authority determine what he did. This was the first autonomous decision Jasper had made since the road outside Galveston, and it changed something in him that could not be unchanged. The years after Peter's departure were outwardly similar to the years before it. The wars continued. The newborns came and were trained and fought and were cold. Jasper carried out his role with the same efficiency he had always brought to it. Maria noticed no visible change in him, which was a measure of how thoroughly Jasper had learned to keep his interior life separated from his outward presentation, how completely the years of managing his gift had trained him to function on the surface of himself rather than from the depths. But something had shifted below that surface. The act of letting Peter go had cracked something open in the architecture of his compliance, had introduced a question that he had not previously allowed himself to ask. Not the obvious question of whether he wanted to leave, because wanting was not the operative category in a situation defined by obligation and necessity. The more fundamental question of whether leaving was possible at all, whether the thing he was doing, the thing he had been doing for decades, was a fixed and permanent condition of his existence, or whether it was simply a situation that could, under the right circumstances, be changed. He did not act on this question immediately. He lived with it instead, the way he had learned to live with things that could not be immediately resolved, keeping it at a manageable distance while it did its slow work on the foundations of his willingness to remain. Peter came back. It was years later, long enough that the specific texture of his absence had become part of the background of Jasper's existence, a space where a particular kind of presence had been and no longer was. Peter arrived without warning, which was characteristic of him, with Charlotte beside him, which was also characteristic of him in the way that things you have never seen before can still feel characteristic of the person doing them. He was different from the newborn Jasper had trained and then released, more settled, more fully himself, whatever that self turned out to be outside of Maria's operation and its particular demands. The quality of his emotional field was cleaner, less complicated by the residues of a life lived in service to someone else's ambitions. He told Jasper there was something different, not in those exact words, because Peter had never been someone who delivered information in the most direct possible way when a less direct way was available to him. But that was the substance of what he communicated. A different way to exist. A different kind of life for someone like them. Outside the wars and outside Maria's accounting, and outside the endless cycle of creation and destruction that had defined Jasper's existence for as long as he had an existence to define. Jasper listened, the way he'd always listened, feeling for the truth beneath the words, rather than simply receiving the words themselves. What he felt in Peter as Peter spoke was not the evangelical fervor of someone trying to convince him of something they were not entirely sure of themselves. It was simpler than that. It was contentment, genuine and specific, the emotional signature of someone reporting accurately on their own experience rather than constructing an argument. Peter was not trying to persuade him. Peter was simply telling him what was true, and the truth of it was evident in how he felt as he spoke. Jasper made the decision to leave Maria the same way he had made the decision to let Peter go, without extended deliberation, without the kind of agonized weighing of consequences that the magnitude of the choice might have warranted. He simply knew, when the moment arrived, what he was going to do. He had known it, in some form, since the night he had stood in the dark and watched Peter and Charlotte disappear, but he had not until now been in the presence of a reason that was both clear and available. His departure from Maria's operation was not dramatic in the way departures in that world sometimes were. There was no confrontation, no final reckoning, no scene of explicit severance. He left while circumstances permitted it, creating the space for his own exit with the same strategic intelligence he had spent decades applying to every other problem Maria had given him. Maria would be angry. He understood that clearly, and he understood that angry was probably an understatement of what Maria would be when she fully registered what had happened and what it meant for her operation. But he was no longer particularly interested in managing Maria's emotional state, which itself was a measure of how far he had come from the soldier who had stood on that road in 1863 and felt her projected calm settle over him like something he had no reason to question. He travelled with Peter and Charlotte for a while, and the difference was immediately and physically apparent. The emotional field around two settled vampires who were living by their own design was quieter than anything Jasper's had existed within since before his transformation. Not silent, because his gift never gave him silence, but quieter, more navigable. The specific compression of existing in Maria's camp, surrounded at all times by newborn chaos and operational tension, and the accumulated emotional weight of a force built on violence and governed by ambition, lifted incrementally as the distance between him and that life increased. He did not know what to do with the quiet at first. He had calibrated his entire existence to the noise, had built every strategy and every habit and every form of management he possessed around the assumption that the noise was constant and inescapable. The relative stillness of traveling with Peter and Charlotte was not entirely comfortable because it was unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity had its own emotional signature that his gift registered with the same fidelity it registered everything else. But underneath the discomfort of the unfamiliar, something else was present, something he had not felt with any consistency since before he could reliably remember feeling anything. Something quiet and tentative, and not yet fully formed, but unmistakably real. The possibility of something different. He did not yet know what different looked like. He did not yet have a destination or a philosophy or a framework for what his existence could be outside of what it had been. He had a direction, which was a way, and a companion, which was Peter, and a quality of emotional field around him that was less crushing than what he had been living inside for decades. And for the moment, these things were enough. The road ahead was uncertain in every sense that mattered, but it was, for the first time in a very long time, a road he was choosing to walk rather than one he had been placed upon without his consent. That distinction, small as it might have seemed from the outside, was everything. The nomadic nomadic life had a rhythm to it that Jasper learned slowly, the way someone learns a language that shares almost no vocabulary with any language they already know. With Maria, existence had been structured by necessity. There were objectives and timelines and the constant operational pressure of a faction at war, which meant that every day had a shape determined from the outside, imposed by circumstance and by Maria's ambitions, and by the simple, relentless logic of survival in a landscape defined by conflict. He had not chosen the structure, but he had inhabited it completely, and its absence now created a disorientation that was more fundamental than he had anticipated. The days without orders felt strange in the specific way that a room feels strange when furniture that has been in it for years is suddenly removed. The shape of the space was the same. Everything else about it felt wrong. He had freedom. He had not had freedom in decades. He did not entirely know what to do with it. Peter and Charlotte moved through the world with the ease of people who had been making their own decisions long enough to have stopped marveling at the fact that they could. They hunted when they were hungry, and travelled when they wanted to travel, and settled briefly in places that suited them before moving on when the staying no longer suited them. There was no calculation behind these decisions beyond their own preferences, no operational logic to satisfy, no authority to consult. They simply lived in the way that people who have genuinely internalized the idea that their life belongs to them simply live. And Jasper watched this and understood it intellectually long before he was able to replicate it in any meaningful sense. They were good company, genuinely, and he was grateful for their presence in the specific way that someone is grateful for a handhold when the ground is uncertain beneath them. They asked nothing of him beyond basic companionship. They did not require him to manage their emotional states or direct their behavior or absorb their chaos and return calm in exchange. They were simply there, two relatively settled vampires living by their own design, and the emotional field they generated around themselves was uncomplicated enough that Jasper could exist within it without constant active management. This itself was extraordinary, though he did not immediately recognize it as such, because he had no recent baseline for comparison. He had forgotten what it felt like to be in proximity to other vampires without the proximity costing him something continuous and significant. He was reminded gradually as the weeks became months, and the comparison with what had come before became clearer with distance. But the feeding was his own education, and not a gentle one. Hunting humans was what nomadic vampires did, and Jasper did it, because the alternative was the animal blood diet that Carlisle Cullen had developed and refined over centuries, and that Jasper had not yet heard of and would not hear of for years. He fed on humans because that was the nature of what he was, because the thirst demanded it with an insistence that animal blood did not adequately address, because Peter and Charlotte fed this way, and there was no framework available to him yet for imagining a different approach. He fed because he had to, and he did not permit himself to linger too long on the implications of the necessity, because lingering on implications was a luxury that his particular gift made genuinely dangerous. But feeding, for Jasper, was never purely physical. It had never been purely physical, not from the first hunt Maria had taken him on in the earliest weeks of his existence. For most vampires, hunting was an instinctual process governed primarily by appetite. The predator located the prey, the hunger drove the pursuit, and the satisfaction of feeding was a physical experience with relatively limited emotional complexity beyond the relief of the thirst being addressed. Jasper experienced all of this, the same instinct and the same physical relief, because his gift did not exempt him from his own nature or offer him any distance from its most fundamental demands, but he experienced everything else as well. Humans, in the moments before and during a hunt, felt things with the full intensity of creatures who understood on some ancient biological level that they were in the presence of a predator. Fear arrived first, almost always, the specific cold clarity of sudden mortal danger, the body's most primal alarm system engaging before the conscious mind had fully processed what it was responding to. And then, underneath and around the fear, whatever was particular to the individual. Grief for things not yet finished. Vivid, specific thoughts of people they loved, arriving with the sharpness that only imminent loss can produce. The peculiar mundane regrets that surface in moments of extremity. Small things that had seemed unimportant until the moment when importance became the only relevant category. Jasper felt all of it without selection or filter, receiving the full interior experience of each person with the same involuntary completeness that his gift had always operated with. Each hunt was not simply a feeding. It was an immersion in the interior life of a person in their final moments. An intimate and entirely unwanted knowledge of what it felt like to be that specific human being at that specific instant. He fed and he felt simultaneously, and the feeling did not stop when the feeding did. It continued into the hours afterward, a residue of the experience that settled into him and did not fully dissipate, adding its weight to everything else he was already carrying. He pulled back from each feeding a little more changed than he had been before it. Not dramatically, not in ways that were visible to Peter or Charlotte or anyone else who might have been observing him, but internally, in the accumulation of things that did not leave even when the immediate experience had passed. Something was building that he could not name clearly and could not address directly, because addressing it would have required first acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would have required sitting with what it meant about the life he was living. He was not ready to sit with that yet. He filed it with the other things he was not yet ready to examine, and went on with the business of existing. He grew quieter over the months that followed his departure from Maria. Peter noticed and said so once, directly and without excessive gentleness, because directness was Peter's default register, and excessive gentleness was not something he had much patience for or talent in. Jasper acknowledged the observation without explaining it, which was also his default register and had been for longer than he could easily trace back to its origin. And Peter did not press, because he understood enough about how Jasper's gift worked to understand that some silences were not withholding, but simply the outer expression of an interior life that was already fully occupied. Charlotte was more patient with the silences. She had a quality of stillness that Jasper found genuinely restful, a capacity to occupy a shared space without requiring that space to be filled with conversation or activity or any particular form of engagement. She did not attempt to draw him out or repair what she could not reach or offer solutions to things she did not fully understand. She simply remained present, consistently and without agenda, and her presence had a steadiness that his gift registered as reliability. This was rarer than it sounded in his experience. Reliability in an emotional field meant that the information he was receiving from her was consistent enough to become background rather than foreground, to require less of his active attention over time as he learned its patterns and could anticipate its movements. He had had very little of this in his existence, and he valued it more than he knew how to say. The three of them ranged across the south and then northward, following no particular route, governed only by inclination and the practical necessities of not remaining in any one place long enough to draw the kind of attention that created complications. They avoided the territories still actively contested by the vampire factions Jasper had spent decades fighting within and against. He had no desire to re-enter that world, not even at its edges. The emotional signature of those territories was something he could feel from a significant distance. The concentrated violence and ambition and barely managed collective bloodlust of factions in ongoing conflict radiating outward like heat from something burning. He gave those territories as wide a margin as geography reasonably permitted. He began during this period to develop a more deliberate and considered relationship with his own gift. For the years of Maria's service, his gift had been primarily something that happened to him, an involuntary reception of whatever emotional information was present in his immediate environment, managed as effectively as he could, but never on his own terms, never in service of his own needs or understanding. The projective aspect, the ability to push emotional states outward into the environment rather than simply receiving them, had been deployed as a tool of Maria's operation, used in service of her objectives and her timelines. He had not thought carefully about what else the gift might be capable of, or what a more intentional relationship with it might look like, because Maria's camp had never provided the interior quiet that careful thought about his own nature required. The nomadic life provided more of that quiet, imperfectly and intermittently, but genuinely. He used it. He began to understand the projective capacity with greater precision, to develop a finer and more deliberate control over what he sent outward and in what direction and at what intensity. He practiced using it narrowly, directing it toward a specific person, rather than broadcasting it generally across a space, which required a different quality of concentration and a more careful awareness of the distinction between his own emotional state and the one he was attempting to project. He practiced restraint, which was the harder discipline, using the ability less rather than more, resisting the deeply ingrained habit of smoothing every emotional rough edge in his environment. That habit had been functional in Maria's camp, where the alternative to managing the emotional environment was being consumed by it. But it had also been continuously costly, a drain he had not fully accounted for, because accounting for it would have required acknowledging that he had a limit, and acknowledging limits in Maria's service had never been something he could afford. Here, the limit could be acknowledged. He was not required to function at maximum capacity every day simply to survive the day. He could choose how much of himself to deploy and how much to hold back, and the practice of making that choice intentionally, rather than simply doing everything that was demanded and hoping enough remained, was his own education. He began also to pay closer attention to the distinction between what he felt and what he was receiving. This sounds simpler than it was. after decades of the two being effectively merged, of his own interior state and the incoming emotional information from his environment being so thoroughly intertwined that separating them required sustained effort and was never entirely complete. The idea of the distinction as something that could be maintained with any reliability felt theoretical, but he worked at it in the quiet stretches of the nomadic life, and he found that the distinction was real and that it could be maintained more consistently than he had previously believed, that there was underneath all the received material a genuine and distinct Jasper with his own feelings and responses and preferences that hadn't been entirely dissolved by decades of absorbing everyone else's. This discovery was more significant than it might appear from the outside. It meant he was not only what the years had made him, it meant something had persisted through all of it that was still recognizably his. The years moved forward in the way that years moved in an immortal existence, not as landmarks, but as continuations. He and Peter and Charlotte were not always together, separating and rejoining with the easy informality of people whose connection was strong enough not to require constant proximity for its maintenance. There were extended periods when Jasper traveled alone, which had a different quality than anything else. The emotional field of a solitary vampire was reduced to whatever the landscape offered in the absence of other people, which in wilderness was very little, and in human settlements was considerably more. He learned his own preference clearly during these solo periods, which was for the wilderness, for the long empty stretches of mountain and forest and open country, where the input was minimal and the quiet was genuine rather than constructed. He was not, during these years, at peace. That would be overstating what the nomadic life provided and understating what he was still carrying. The residue of the southern wars was not something that the simple passage of time dissolved, and the ongoing accumulation of each human feeding added to it rather than replacing it. He was not recovering in any clean or linear sense, but he was for the first time in a situation that was not actively making things worse, which was different enough from what had preceded it to feel, on the better days, like something approaching rest. The year 1948 found him moving through the northeastern states alone. Peter and Charlotte some distance away in their own seasonal ranging. The autumn had arrived with the particular clarity that the northeastern air carried in that season, cold and bright, and carrying information about winter's approach that even a vampire noticed as atmosphere rather than threat. He was in Philadelphia without strong reason for being specifically there, drawn by the logic of movement rather than any particular destination, passing through in the way that nomadic existence produced a constant procession of passing through. The city had a density that he found neither comfortable nor unbearable. Urban emotional fields were always more demanding than wilderness, the sheer concentration of human lives generating a corresponding concentration of emotional input that required more active management than empty landscapes. Philadelphia in the late 1940s was a city still reorganizing itself after the disruptions of the war years, carrying the specific emotional texture of a place where relief and grief existed in close proximity, where the people who had come back were navigating the complicated experience of having come back, and where those who were grieving what and who had not returned were doing so in the midst of a world that was attempting, with varying degrees of success, to move forward. Jasper felt all of this as he moved through the city, managing it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been managing urban emotional fields for years, filtering the most intense signals, allowing the background material to remain background, keeping enough of his attention free to function practically. He went into a diner in the late afternoon because the performance of human behavior in cold weather included seeking warmth, and because a diner offered a corner booth with good sight lines and manageable noise levels, and the kind of anonymous public environment in which a solitary person attracted no particular attention. He was sitting in that corner booth, his hands around a cup of coffee he had no intention of drinking, his attention distributed across the room in the unfocused way he had learned to maintain as a default. When the door opened, he felt her before he had fully processed the visual information her arrival provided. The emotional signature that reached him was unlike anything in his considerable catalogue of received human and vampire feeling. It was not the careful restraint of a disciplined vampire, though restraint was present. It was not the complicated layering of suppressed thirst and managed instinct that characterized every other vampire he had been in proximity to, himself included. Underneath and through all of that was something else entirely, something so clean and so specific and so completely unperformed that it stopped him in the middle of whatever thought he had been half-forming and demanded his full attention. Joy. Genuine, unguarded, uncomplicated joy. The kind that existed in young children encountering something wonderful for the first time, or in people surprised by beauty they had not been expecting. In a vampire, in any vampire he had encountered in his entire existence, he had never felt anything that resembled it. Not because vampires were incapable of positive feeling, but because whatever positive feeling they carried was always complicated by the context of what they were, overlaid with restraint and wariness and the chronic awareness of their own nature. This had none of that complexity. It was simply joy, offered into the air around her without apology or qualification. She sat down across from him without being invited, and he let her, because his gift had already told him everything relevant about her intentions, and her intentions were entirely without threat or concealment. She was small, dark-haired, with the deep gold eyes of a vampire who had fed recently and carefully. She looked at him with the specific quality of recognition that belongs to someone finally arriving somewhere they have been traveling toward for a long time. And when she spoke, her voice had the particular steadiness of someone saying something they have known for long enough, that saying it feels less like a declaration than a simple statement of existing fact. She said she had been waiting for him. Jasper's first instinct was the instinct of someone who had spent decades learning to evaluate the stated intentions of others against the emotional truth his gift provided. A reflex of assessment that had kept him functional through years of navigating Maria's world and the world of the Southern Wars. He applied it now, automatically, and without deciding to, measuring what she said against what he felt from her. The measurement was immediate and unambiguous. She was not constructing a position. She was not approaching him with a concealed objective that her words were designed to obscure. What she felt as she spoke was precisely what her words described: the calm certainty of someone reporting accurately on their own experience. She had been waiting for him. She knew him, or knew of him, in the way that someone with a gift of foresight could know a person before meeting them. She had seen something, and she was here because of what she had seen, and she was confident in all of it without that confidence containing a single thread of performance. She told him her name was Alice. She told him about her gift, the visions of futures not yet arrived, the ability to see the shape of things before they happened. She told him she had seen a life for both of them that was different from what either of them had been living, that she knew where they needed to go and who they needed to find, and that the path she was describing was one she had already seen them walking, which meant she was not proposing something uncertain, but reporting something she had already witnessed in the particular way that her gift allowed her to witness things. Jasper sat across from her in the diner and felt the quality of what she carried, the extraordinary warmth of a person who had found their own footing in the world and who was offering, without conditions or agenda, to help him find his. He was not certain. He was too careful and had been burned too specifically by certainty offered without warrant, to be certain on the basis of one conversation in a diner in Philadelphia. But something in him that had been very quiet for a very long time recognized something in her, recognized the quality of what she was offering and the genuine nature of the offer, and that recognition did not require certainty to be actionable. He followed her, not because he believed everything yet, but because she believed it fully and without reservation, and her belief was the most genuinely felt thing he had encountered in a very long time. For now, in the long exhaustion of his wandering years, that was enough to move toward. Alice moved through the world with a certainty that Jasper found both disorienting and, in a way he could not immediately articulate, deeply restful. She did not deliberate. She did not pause at crossroads and weigh options and arrive at decisions through the visible machinery of reasoning that most people employed. She simply knew where she was going and went there, guided by the visions that arrived in her mind with the quiet authority of things already decided. And the effect of traveling with someone who operated this way was that the journey itself felt less like navigation and more like arrival extended over time. They were always, in Alice's experience of it, already on their way to where they were supposed to be. The uncertainty that characterized most journeys was absent, replaced by a forward momentum that asked nothing of Jasper except that he continue moving in the direction she indicated. He found this easier to accept than he would have predicted, which itself told him something about how thoroughly exhausted he had become with uncertainty. He had spent decades in Maria's world making decisions under conditions of incomplete information, calculating odds in real time, functioning as the strategic intelligence of an operation that was always in motion and always at risk. The rest that Alice's certainty provided was not the rest of inactivity, but the rest of not having to be the one who knew. She knew. He could follow. For someone who had been responsible for knowing things in situations where being wrong had immediate and irreversible consequences, the experience of following someone else's reliable knowledge was something close to relief. They traveled for weeks, Alice's visions guiding their route with adjustments she made fluidly as the futures she was watching shifted in response to decisions not yet made. Jasper learned her gift during this period, not through explanation, though she explained it willingly and in considerable detail, but through the experience of watching it operate in real time. He could feel when a vision arrived, the specific quality of her attention shifting inward. The brief absence of full presence followed by a return that carried new information. He learned to read the emotional signature of different kinds of visions, the calm that accompanied confirmation of something she had already seen, the more complex feeling that accompanied something new or something that complicated what she had previously known. He also felt throughout this journey, and with increasing clarity as the days accumulated, the specific quality of what Alice felt when she looked at him or spoke to him or simply existed in his proximity. It was not romantic feeling, not yet, or not in a form he could clearly identify as such. It was something more foundational than that, a quality of recognition and care that operated at a level below the categories of romantic or platonic or any other relational label. She simply, genuinely, was glad he was there. The gladness was uncomplicated and consistent, and entirely without the conditional quality that characterized most feelings he had received from other people. The sense that the warmth was dependent on his continued usefulness or compliance or performance of a particular role. Her gladness at his presence did not seem to require anything of him at all. It simply existed, directed at him, because he was there. He had very little experience of being cared for in this way, and he did not know immediately what to do with it. He received it carefully, the way someone handles something unfamiliar that they suspect might be valuable, but have not yet learned the proper way to hold. The Cullen house was in a rural area of the Pacific Northwest. When Alice first brought him to it, the family settled into one of their periodic residences, the particular location chosen for the same reasons that all their locations were chosen. Sufficient isolation, sufficient cloud cover, sufficient distance from communities large enough to make their unchanging faces a liability over time. Carlyle had been in this location for several years, long enough that the house had developed the quality of genuine habitation rather than temporary occupation, the subtle accumulation of objects and arrangements that indicated people who had allowed themselves to settle rather than simply stopped. Carlyle met them at the door. Jasper's gift gave him an immediate and comprehensive reading of Carlyle Cullen, before a single word had been exchanged, before any conventional social information had been offered or received. What he felt from Carlyle was, by a significant margin, unlike anything he had felt from another vampire in his entire existence. The thirst was there, present and acknowledged, the baseline condition of their kind that never entirely disappeared regardless of how long or how carefully it was managed, but it was held, not suppressed in the way that suppression usually felt, which was the sensation of something under pressure, of force being applied to contain something that was continuously pushing back. Carlyle's management of his thirst felt different from that. It felt like a long-established and largely peaceable arrangement between himself and the most demanding aspect of his nature, a negotiation completed long ago whose terms had been honored for so long that the original difficulty of honoring them had faded from the foreground of his experience. Underneath and around the managed thirst was something that Jasper also had not encountered in a vampire before. Genuine compassion, not as a performance or a practiced presentation, but as an actual continuous feature of Carlyle's emotional landscape, as present and consistent as the thirst and considerably more comfortable to be in proximity to. He looked at Jasper and Alice and felt, without apparent effort or deliberation, glad that they had arrived and concerned for their well-being and interested in who they were and what they needed. The gladness and the concern and the interest were not sequential, not the product of rapid social calculation producing appropriate responses. They were simultaneous and apparently effortless, the natural expression of a person whose orientation toward others was fundamentally one of care. Jasper stood in the doorway of the Cullen house and received all of this and was, for a moment, simply unable to process it quickly enough to respond to it normally. He had prepared himself in the weeks of travel for the experience of meeting a larger group of vampires than he had been in proximity to since leaving Maria's operation. He had anticipated the work it would require, the management of multiple emotional fields simultaneously, the sorting of his own experience from the incoming material of a whole coven's interior lives. He had not prepared himself for the possibility that the coven's interior lives might not be, in the main, painful to receive. The rest of the family presented themselves over the course of that first day, each one arriving in Jasper's awareness with their own distinct emotional signature before they arrived in any conventional social sense. Esme came with warmth that was specifically maternal in its quality, a feeling that oriented itself naturally toward the people around her and asked what they needed and directed itself accordingly. She felt Jasper's exhaustion and the particular quality of his wariness and responded to both with the instinctive gentleness of someone who understood, without needing it explained, that a person who arrived in that state needed to be approached carefully rather than enthusiastically. She gave him space while making clear the space was warm, which was a more sophisticated form of welcome than most people managed. Edward was more complicated, his emotional field carrying the specific layering of someone who had been in a state of prolonged and unresolved melancholy for long enough that the melancholy had become structural, built into the architecture of his daily experience rather than sitting on the surface of it. Jasper could feel the isolation that Edward carried, the particular loneliness of someone whose gift gave them access to the interior lives of everyone around them, while simultaneously preventing the kind of genuine mutual unknowing that ordinary connection required. He recognized something in it, though his own experience of his gift and its isolating effects was different from Edward's in its specific mechanics. The recognition established between them in those first days, a kind of silent mutual acknowledgement that required no discussion to be genuine. Emmett arrived in Jasper's awareness like weather, large and uncomplicated, and immediately filling whatever space he occupied, without apparent awareness of the displacement. His emotional field was the most straightforwardly positive of anyone Jasper had encountered in his vampire existence, not because it was simple, which it was not, but because it was oriented predominantly outward and upward, interested in the world around it and finding that world more frequently entertaining than threatening. The thirst was present in Emmett, as it was present in all of them, but in him, it seemed to occupy a smaller proportion of his overall emotional landscape than in most vampires Jasper had known, crowded out by the enthusiasm that was apparently his default relationship with existence. Rosalie was the most guarded, her emotional field presenting a surface that was composed and controlled, and that Jasper could read beneath only with the kind of sustained attention that would have been impolite to direct at someone who had not invited it. Beneath the composure was grief, old and specific and not resolved, kind of grief that has been lived with for long enough that the person carrying it has stopped expecting it to leave and has instead built their daily life around its permanent presence. He did not press on it. He acknowledged it internally, catalogued it with the care he gave to all emotional information about people in his proximity, and let it be. Alice, beside him, was the constant. Whatever else the environment offered in terms of emotional complexity, her presence in his awareness was the fixed point around which everything else moved, the one signal he had already learned well enough that it required no active processing. She was steady in a way that nothing else in his experience had been steady, and he was already, in ways he was only beginning to understand, orienting toward that steadiness the way a compass orients toward north. The transition to animal blood began almost immediately. Carlyle explained the practice with the precision and care of a doctor explaining a treatment plan, which was in fact almost exactly what it was. The physiological reality was straightforward, if not simple. Animal blood sustained the vampire metabolism. It addressed the thirst imperfectly, providing the basic biological function that blood provided without the full satisfaction that human blood delivered. The thirst was not eliminated by animal feeding. It was managed, reduced from an acute and pressing demand to a chronic and manageable ache, which was a significant improvement, even if it was not a solution. Jasper understood all of this and accepted it without resistance, because the decision to adopt the Cullen approach to feeding had been implicit in the decision to come here, and he had made that decision. What he had not fully calculated, because it was not possible to calculate in advance, was what this transition would mean for his gift specifically. In the weeks and months following his arrival, as the practice of animal feeding replaced the practice of human feeding that had characterized his entire vampire existence, the change in his internal experience was not only the change of his own thirst being addressed differently, it was also the change in what he was receiving from his family members, because they were all engaged in the same practice, all managing the same insufficient satisfaction of animal blood, and all of them did so continuously and daily. The emotional signature of managed thirst that was being held at a controlled level through regular animal feeding and deliberate restraint, was different from the emotional signature of thirst being given what it wanted. It was quieter, less acute, but also more persistent. A continuous low signal rather than the sharp peaks and drops of a thirst cycle governed by human feeding. 6 vampires maintaining this state simultaneously meant that Jasper was receiving 6 versions of this continuous signal at all times, layered on top of his own version of the same feeling. The layering was not as overwhelming as the newborn chaos of Maria's camp had been, but it was constant in a way that the newborn chaos had not been, because newborns eventually either matured or were destroyed, while the Cullen family's managed thirst was a permanent condition with no endpoint. It was always there. He was always feeling it from all of them on top of his own. The cumulative weight of this, sustained without interruption, was something he could not explain to anyone around him in terms that would have conveyed its full texture, because none of them felt anything from the others. They managed their own thirst and observed each other's management from the outside, understanding it intellectually and empathetically without experiencing it directly. Jasper experienced it directly from all of them simultaneously, every hour of every day. He did not say this to anyone in those early months, He was still in the process of determining what could and could not be communicated about his experience, what would be understood, and what would only produce concern without producing any actionable response to the concern. He managed it the way he managed most things, through the careful internal work of sorting his own state from the received material, of maintaining the boundary between what was his and what was everyone else's, of functioning at the surface with whatever he could access that did not require full depth. School was his own specific challenge, and a significant one. The Cullen family attended the local high school as part of the carefully maintained performance of humanity that their existence required. Jasper had done versions of this before, had navigated human social environments as a vampire with a gift that made those environments considerably more demanding than they were for most. But high school, as a specific environment, had qualities that made it particularly taxing in ways that other human spaces did not. The sheer volume of adolescent emotional experience concentrated in a relatively small building was something that had to be encountered to be properly understood. Teenagers felt things with an intensity and a lack of filtering that adult humans generally moderated, though they did not lose entirely. The emotional regulation that most adults had developed through experience and practice, the ability to experience a feeling without immediately and fully inhabiting it, was still being developed in adolescence, which meant that what Jasper received from a hallway full of high school students was not the managed and modulated emotional field of adult humans, but something rawer and more immediate. Someone anxious about an examination was not simply experiencing anxiety. They were consumed by it, the feeling occupying a disproportionate share of their available attention and broadcasting outward at a corresponding intensity. Someone embarrassed in a social situation was not experiencing a mild and manageable discomfort. They were experiencing something that felt in the full force of adolescent nervous system response, like a genuine emergency. Someone in the early stages of romantic feeling was living in a state of emotional intensity that adults learn to contextualize and moderate, but the teenagers experienced with the full directness of something they had not yet developed the framework to manage. Jasper felt all of it, all day from hundreds of sources simultaneously. He developed strategies. He always developed strategies because his existence required them. He positioned himself at the edges of spaces rather than the centers, where the density of incoming signal was lower. He chose routes through the building that minimized time spent in the highest traffic areas, where the concentration of emotional input peaked during the transitions between classes. He maintained the performance of normalcy that the situation required, while directing the majority of his actual attention to the ongoing work of managing what his gift was delivering. He did not use his projective ability in the school environment, or used it only minimally and carefully, because using it extensively would have altered the emotional experience of the humans around him in ways that would have been difficult to explain and that went beyond what the situation required. He was there to be a high school student, not to manage the emotional weather of the entire building. He contained himself and did the work internally and went home at the end of each day carrying the accumulated weight of 6 hours of unrestricted adolescent feeling added to everything else. Alice was a consistent relief, not because her presence eliminated what he was receiving from everyone else, because it did not, but because she was the one signal in his environment that was always familiar, always readable without effort, always warm without condition. She sat beside him in the classes they shared and moved through the school day in her characteristic way, slightly ahead of the present moment, navigating the social terrain with the advantage of knowing what was coming and finding this more amusing than burdensome. Her amusement was a quality he had come to appreciate specifically because it carried a lightness that was rare in his immediate experience, and that his gift received with something close to gratitude. He was learning, during these first years with the Cullens, the specific shape of what it meant to choose this life rather than simply endure it. The distinction was not always clear or always felt. There were days when the weight of everything he was carrying made the idea of choice feel theoretical, a concept that applied to people whose situations were simpler than his. But there were also days when the specific quality of what surrounded him, the genuine care of his family, the steadiness of Alice, the evidence everywhere that vampires could choose to be something other than what their most basic instincts demanded, made the weight feel less like a burden and more like a price he had chosen to pay for something he had chosen to have. He was still learning the difference between those two experiences. He suspected it would take longer than he had been alive, in any form, to learn it completely. But he was, for the first time in his existence, in a place that was genuinely trying to help him learn it. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. The Cullen family arrived in Forks, Washington, with the practiced efficiency of people who had relocated many times before and had long since reduced the process to something approaching routine. The town suited them in the specific ways that mattered. The cloud cover was extraordinary, persistent in a way that few places in the continental United States could offer. The kind of grey and reliable overcast that made outdoor movement during daylight hours a practical reality rather than a calculated risk. The population was small enough that faces were remembered, but also small enough that the Cullen family's carefully constructed social presence, the adopted children of a well-regarded local doctor, was a story that had been accepted without significant scrutiny in previous days and would be accepted again. The forest pressed in close on all sides, offering the kind of immediate wilderness access that made hunting practical without requiring the long absences that more urban locations demanded. Jasper evaluated all of this with a part of his attention that was always, regardless of circumstances, conducting an ongoing threat assessment of his environment. It was not a deliberate or effortful process. It was simply how he had learned to exist. The baseline vigilance of someone who had spent decades in environments where inattention had immediate and serious consequences. Forks registered as manageable. The population density was low enough that the emotional input from the town itself was not overwhelming. The social dynamics of the high school were sufficiently familiar from previous iterations that he could anticipate most of what they would require of him, and the family's established rhythms provided a structural stability that made the transition less disruptive than it might otherwise have been. What he had not anticipated, and could not have anticipated, was Edward. Not Edward's presence, which was a constant and familiar feature of Jasper's existence, but Edward's transformation over the early weeks of the Forks day, the specific and unmistakable way in which someone who's been living in a state of prolonged emotional flatness begins to change when something enters their life that disrupts that flatness. Jasper felt it before he understood it, which was the usual sequence with his gift. He felt the shift in Edward's emotional field, the way the characteristic melancholy that had been Edward's dominant register for as long as Jasper had known him began to develop new frequencies, new intensities, new qualities that had not previously been present. He felt the conflict first. A sharp, specific internal tension that Edward was managing with his characteristic self-containment, not expressing outwardly in any way that would have been visible to someone without Jasper's gift, but broadcasting clearly into the emotional field of the house. Then the conflict became more layered, something complicated by feelings that Edward was clearly not comfortable with, and was attempting to manage by sheer force of the discipline he had developed over decades. And underneath all of that, barely accessible beneath the layers of conflict and discomfort and deliberate suppression, something that Jasper had not felt from Edward before. Want. Genuine, specific, directed want, of the kind that was not about thirst, or not only about thirst, but about a person, about a particular person, whose existence had apparently disrupted Edward's careful equilibrium in ways that were not yet fully understood even by Edward himself. Jasper did not ask. He observed, received the information his gift provided, and waited for the situation to clarify itself, because situations involving Edward's emotional life had a tendency to clarify themselves eventually, whether or not anyone intervened. The girl's name was Bella Swan. She arrived in the collective awareness of the Cullen family through Alice's visions first, and then through Edward's increasingly obvious preoccupation, and then through her actual physical presence when Edward began, cautiously and with evident ongoing internal conflict, to bring her into proximity with the family. Jasper understood her significance before he had spent any meaningful time in her company, simply by reading what she meant in the emotional field of the people around her, which was in many ways more informative than any direct interaction could have been. What he understood was this: she mattered. Not in the abstract way that people who were close to family members always mattered, the secondary importance of people who were important to someone you cared about. She mattered specifically in a way that was already beginning to alter the emotional landscape of the entire family, rather than just of Edward. Alice felt genuine affection for her that was developing with the particular warmth of someone who had seen a friendship in vision and was now watching that friendship arrive in reality. Esme felt a maternal pull toward her that was instinctive rather than cultivated. Even Carlyle, whose emotional equilibrium was the most stable of any of them, showed the subtle indicators of someone recalibrating their understanding of a situation in response to new information. And then there was what Jasper himself felt when Bella was in the house, which was something he examined with great care and did not discuss with anyone. She was human. This was the baseline fact of her presence in their space, the fact from which everything else proceeded. A human in a house full of vampires generated a particular quality of emotional response in those vampires, regardless of how practiced and committed their restraint was, because the presence of human blood in an enclosed space was not a neutral stimulus for any of them. Jasper felt his own response, the familiar and disciplined management of his own thirst spiking modestly in her presence and being brought back under control through the mechanisms he had spent years developing. This was manageable. He had managed this caliber of challenge many times in the high school environment. What was not manageable in the same straightforward way was what her presence did to the emotional field of the family around him. Each family member responded to Bella's presence with their own specific version of the same fundamental reality. A brief and involuntary increase in the awareness of thirst. The predatory instinct registering the proximity of its primary stimulus before the practiced will brought it back under governance. These responses were small. They were controlled quickly. They were, by any objective measure, successful examples of the restraint that the Cullen family had spent decades developing. None of them acted on these responses. None of them came close to acting on them. But Jasper felt every single one. Each small spike in each family member's thirst arrived in his nervous system with the same immediacy and the same weight, as if it had been his own. Esme's brief and quickly managed response added itself to his own management burden. Edward's more complex response, tangled as it was with the particular intensity of his feelings about Bella, that made the proximity of her blood simultaneously more and less difficult than it would have been for a vampire with simpler feelings about the source, arrived in Jasper's awareness as a layered and complicated signal that required more sorting than a simpler response would have. Emmett's straightforward and efficiently managed spike, Rosalie's carefully contained reaction, held behind the wall of her composure with a specific effort that Jasper could feel as effort, even when no one else could see it. All of it landed in him simultaneously, on top of his own response. Every time Bella was present, he was managing not one vampire's response to a human in their space, but 6. And the cumulative weight of this management was something he absorbed into the ongoing accounting of his daily burden without comment, because comment would have required explanation, and explanation would have required everyone around him to understand something about his experience that he was not certain any of them had the framework to fully grasp. He kept his distance from Bella, more than the others did, more than the situation strictly required. He positioned himself at the far edges of shared spaces when she was present, chose seats that maximized the distance between them, found reasons to be in different rooms when her presence in a room was not necessary for him to be there as well. This was not rudeness, or he did not intend it as rudeness, though he was aware it might read that way from the outside. It was necessity, the same kind of spatial management he employed in the high school hallways, the reduction of input density through deliberate positioning. Bella, to her credit, did not appear to take offense. She had a quality of perception about her that was unusual for someone her age, an awareness that there were dynamics in the space around her that she did not fully understand, and that it was wiser to observe than to press. She watched Jasper with the careful attention of someone taking notes, not intrusively but genuinely, and he received from her a quality of thoughtful assessment that he found, despite everything, more comfortable than the alternative would have been. She was trying to understand rather than simply react, and that quality of approach he could respect. September arrived with the shift in light that autumn brought to the Pacific Northwest. The angle of the sun changing in ways that were perceptible to vampire senses well before human senses registered them. The leaves began their slow turning. The air carried the particular quality of the season's change. And Alice, whose visions had been showing her pieces of an upcoming occasion, with the warm anticipation of someone who enjoyed celebrations and looked forward to producing them, began planning what she called a small gathering for Bella's birthday. Jasper felt Alice's anticipation throughout the planning period and received it as he received all of her feelings, with a particular gratitude of something familiar and warm in an environment that was otherwise continuously demanding. He did not share her anticipation about the event itself, for reasons that were practical rather than personal. A birthday party meant Bella in their house for an extended period. It meant an enclosed space, intimate rather than the more dispersed geography of the school. It meant a concentrated social occasion with a particular emotional intensity that celebrations generated. Everyone's feelings heightened by the specific warmth of wanting someone to feel valued and happy. And it meant almost certainly human food, which meant Bella eating and the specific associations that eating generated in the sensory awareness of vampires designed to recognize blood in all its contexts. He hunted extensively in the days before the party. This was not unusual for him before any occasion that would involve prolonged proximity to Bella, but he was more thorough than usual, taking more than his body strictly required, building the buffer of recent feeding to its maximum possible extent. He did not discuss this preparation with anyone, though Alice knew, because Alice generally knew the practical preparations Jasper made for situations her visions had already shown her. The evening of September 13 arrived. Bella came into the house and the family gathered around her with the warmth that was genuine rather than performed, because the Cullen family had, over the months of her increasing presence in their lives, developed real feelings for her that did not require manufacture. Jasper felt the room's emotional temperature as she arrived, the collective gladness of people pleased to see someone they cared about, layered with the involuntary and quickly managed physiological responses that her presence always generated. He positioned himself in his characteristic location, at the edge of the gathering, present enough to be part of the occasion without occupying the center of a space. He found it easier to manage from the periphery. Bella was uncomfortable with the attention in the specific way she was always uncomfortable with being the center of anyone's focus. Her embarrassment at being made much of arriving in Jasper's awareness as a warm and slightly pained feeling that was entirely characteristic of her, and that he had come to recognize as one of her consistent emotional signatures. Underneath the embarrassment was genuine pleasure, the kind that people who are unused to being celebrated feel when the celebration is offered by people they trust. It was a complicated combination, and it was hers, and receiving it added a human texture to the room's emotional field that was different from what he received from the vampires around him. She opened the gifts. The family watched with the combined attention of people who had put thought into their offerings and wanted those offerings to be received well. A small shared anxiety about her response that Jasper felt from multiple directions simultaneously. And then the paper tore, and the small sound of it was followed immediately by something that Jasper had been braced for without knowing precisely when it would arrive. The scent of blood, a single drop, one small cut from the edge of the wrapping paper, the most minor of injuries, the kind that a human would barely register as anything beyond a brief and trivial discomfort. The blood was minimal. The wound was negligible. The physiological reality of the situation was, objectively, minor. What happened in Jasper's nervous system in the moment the scent reached the room was not minor. His own thirst responded first, because it was his, because the stimulus was real, and his body's response to it was the same body's response that had been operating since his transformation, and that no amount of preparation entirely neutralized. The spike was sharp and immediate, and he met it with the full force of the management strategies he had spent years developing. The practiced redirection of attention, the deliberate slowing of the instinctive physical response, the imposition of will over the body's most immediate demand. He was doing this actively when the rest arrived. Rosalie's response hit him first, sharp and sudden, and quickly pulled back, but not before the spike of it had fully registered in his nervous system as an additional weight on top of his own. Then Emmett's, less sharp but real, arriving a fraction of a second behind Rosalie's. Then the more complex signal from Edward, the particular tangle of his feelings about Bella making his response different in character from the others, more conflicted, more layered, but not smaller. And Esme's, quieter than the others, were present, and Alice's, the most controlled of all of them, but still there, still a real signal, still adding its increment to the cumulative total that Jasper was receiving. All of it arrived within the same moment, not sequentially, not one after another with sufficient interval between them to be processed individually, simultaneously, or close enough to simultaneously that the distinction was meaningless in practice. 6 responses to the same stimulus, 6 versions of the same fundamental spike and the same fundamental craving, all of them landing in Jasper's nervous system at the same time, added directly to his own response without buffer or interval or any mechanism for managing the accumulation as a whole, rather than as individual components. The total was not 6 times his own response. It was something that did not reduce to arithmetic, something that the language of addition did not adequately describe. It was a wave, a compound and simultaneous surge that overwhelmed the management strategies he had deployed for his own response alone, because those strategies had been calibrated for his own response alone. They were sufficient for 1. They were not sufficient for 7. He moved. The movement was not entirely voluntary, in the sense that it was not the product of a deliberate decision reached through the weighing of options. It was the body acting before the mind had completed its assessment of the situation, the deep instinct of a creature that had spent decades in an environment where proximity to blood and hesitation about responding to it were a combination that had consequences. He lunged, and the word for what he was doing in that instant was not thinking, or not thinking in any way that would have produced a different action, even if he had been given more time. Edward moved faster. Jasper felt the impact of Edward's intervention as a physical interruption and as an emotional one. The specific quality of Edward's protective fury arriving in Jasper's awareness alongside the physical reality of being separated from Bella and from the source of the stimulus that had overwhelmed his defenses. The intervention worked. The separation worked. The distance created by Emmett and the others physically moving Jasper back worked, because distance from the stimulus was the most effective management tool available, and it was now being applied with the urgency the situation warranted. He came back to himself in increments. The process of returning to the state he had been in before the moment of the paper cut was not instantaneous and was not clean. The compound surge he had experienced did not simply stop when the stimulus was removed. It diminished, the way a wave diminishes after breaking gradually and unevenly, the peaks and troughs of it becoming smaller and less frequent, until eventually the general level dropped back towards something that resembled his normal baseline. He was aware, as this happened, of the emotional field of the room around him, which had changed significantly from what it had been when the evening began. The warmth and gladness of the gathering had been replaced by something more complicated, a mixture of concern and shock, and the specific quality of feeling that follows a close call, the adrenaline of a thing that almost happened and didn't. Bella's fear was present, real and specific, and receiving it was something he absorbed into everything else he was already processing, with the particular discomfort of knowing that he was the cause of it. Carlyle attended to Bella's wound in the other room. The rest of the family organized themselves around the aftermath of the moment with the efficiency of people who had contingency responses for this kind of situation, because they were people who had needed contingency responses before. Jasper stood apart from all of this and did the interior work that the moment required, which was the work of reassembling the management architecture that the compound surge had disrupted, of returning to the careful equilibrium that was his daily operational standard. The shame was present. He did not try to avoid it, because trying to avoid it would have required energy he needed for the reassembly, and because the shame was, in this case, partly his own and partly received from the emotional field of the people around him, and sorting them from each other was itself part of the work. His own shame had a specific quality, the self-assessment of someone who had failed at something they had prepared carefully for and had believed they were adequately prepared for. The received shame from the emotional field of the room was different, more diffuse, belonging to no single person, but to the collective discomfort of a family that had allowed a situation to develop that had endangered someone they cared about. What the room could not feel, what none of them could feel because none of them were Jasper, was the full accounting of what had happened in the moment of the paper cut. They had each experienced their own response, managed it, and moved on. They had not experienced the responses of the people beside them as their own simultaneous experience. They could not know what it had felt like from inside his specific position, the compound and layered and perfectly timed convergence of 6 separate responses arriving at once on top of his own. He could not tell them this without it sounding like a justification, and he was not interested in justification. What had happened, and the fact that his gift had made it harder than it appeared from the outside did not change the fact that he had moved toward Bella in a moment when moving toward Bella was the most dangerous thing he could have done. The explanation was true, but the truth of it did not erase what it explained. He carried both of these things forward from that evening. The truth of what had actually happened and the responsibility for what he had done regardless. He carried them the way he carried everything, internally and without extensive commentary, adding them to the ongoing accounting of his existence. The birthday party ended. The family moved through the aftermath with care and with the particular tenderness that followed moments that reminded them all of what they were and what that meant for the people they allowed into their lives. Alice cleaned the space with characteristic briskness, her visions presumably already showing her the shape of what came next. Her feelings, as she worked a complicated mixture of regret and determination that Jasper received and held with the careful attention he gave to everything that came from her. Bella went home with Carlisle's care and Edward's escort, and the weight of an evening that had reminded her, as certain evenings will, of the precise nature of the world she had chosen to be close to. Jasper stood in the house after she had gone and felt the room settle back toward its ordinary baseline. The family's emotional fields returning to their familiar patterns, the specific charge of the evening gradually dissipating into the quieter texture of an ordinary night. He had not been weak. He understood this, even in the immediate aftermath, even carrying the shame of the moment. He had been overwhelmed, which was different, and the distinction mattered, even if he was the only one who knew enough about his specific experience to understand why it mattered. He stood at the edge of the room, as he always stood at the edge of rooms, and he held what he knew, and he continued. The days after the birthday party had a specific quality that Jasper recognized from other moments in his existence, when the ordinary management of daily life had been disrupted by an event that revealed the gap between what everyone around him believed about his situation and what his situation actually was. It was not that anyone treated him differently in any obvious or deliberate way. The Cullen family was too practiced at managing difficult moments, too experienced at reassembling the ordinary surface of their shared existence after disruptions, to allow the aftermath of the birthday party to express itself as anything as legible as changed behavior or altered tone. Carlisle offered the gentle and unobtrusive support that was his characteristic response to family difficulty. Esme's warmth continued in its consistent way. Alice remained beside him with the steadiness that had become the most reliable constant in his experience. Emmett found reasons to be around without making a project of being around, which was its own form of consideration. What changed was subtler than behavior. It was in the quality of attention directed at him, the specific texture of the emotional field that the family generated around him in the days following the incident. Concern was present, genuine and carefully modulated. The kind of concern that people who care about someone feel when that someone has come close to something dangerous and has been shaken by the nearness of it. He received this from all of them in their different registers. Carlisle's concern carrying the particular quality of a doctor assessing a patient. Esme's the specific warmth of a mother who wants to fix something and cannot identify the right tool. He received it all and sorted it into the ongoing accounting of his interior life and went on with the business of existing. Edward made his decision to leave in the days following the party. Jasper felt this before it was announced, before Edward had fully committed to the decision in his own mind, because the emotional signature of someone moving toward a major resolution has a specific quality that he had learned to recognize over many years of living in close proximity to people in the process of deciding things. Edward's characteristic melancholy deepened and then, unexpectedly, clarified. The complexity of his feeling about Bella, the layered tangle of love and fear and guilt and thirst, and the specific torture of his gift being silent in her presence, began to organize itself around a single point of determination. The determination had a cold quality, the emotional signature of someone who has decided to do something they believe is necessary and who has processed enough of the grief of that decision to be able to act on it without being stopped by the feeling. he left. The family restructured itself around his absence the way families restructure around any significant departure, adjusting the patterns and rhythms of shared existence to account for the change configuration. And the house became quieter. This was the thing that Jasper noticed most directly in the weeks after Edward's departure, and it was not quiet in any conventional sense. Not quiet in the way that a space becomes quiet when the person who talked most is no longer in it. Edward had rarely been the most vocal presence in any room. His contribution to the auditory environment of the house had never been particularly large. What he had contributed, constantly and without interruption, was an emotional field of considerable complexity and intensity, the particular turbulence of someone living in prolonged inner conflict, and that field had been a consistent feature of Jasper's sensory environment for as long as he had been in the family. Its absence was perceptible in the way that the cessation of a sound you have stopped consciously hearing is perceptible only when it stops. The house's emotional weather, without Edward's specific contribution, was simpler. Not dramatically, not in ways that anyone without Jasper's gift would have registered, but genuinely. The family's collective baseline shifted slightly toward the quieter end of its range, and Jasper felt this shift as a modest and involuntary relief that he examined with some care, because the relief was not uncomplicated. It was accompanied by the knowledge of what Edward's departure had cost, and was costing, and would cost, and receiving the grief of the family about that departure meant the relief was never more than partial, always layered with what had existed alongside. But it was there, and he acknowledged it, because his own interior honesty was one of the few things the years had not managed to erode entirely. This period, the months of the family's time in Forks without Edward, provided Jasper with something that he had not had in sufficient quantity since joining the Cullens. Time to observe his own experience with some degree of the distance that direct observation requires. The acute challenge of Bella's regular presence had been removed. The specific compound burden of managing the family's collective responses to her proximity had temporarily lifted. What remained was the ordinary daily burden of his existence, which was not small, but which was at least familiar enough that he could examine it with some clarity rather than simply enduring it. He began, during this period, to try to articulate to himself the specific architecture of what he carried every day. Mornings began before the rest of the family was active in any visible way, because vampires did not sleep, and the house in the early hours had the particular quality of contained stillness that preceded the day's social requirement. In those hours, Jasper could feel the family's resting emotional states, each one distinct and characteristic. Carlyle and Esme together generated a warmth that was one of the most consistent and comfortable signals in his environment. The specific quality of two people who had been deeply at ease with each other for long enough that ease had become their default emotional register. Alice's resting state was a soft brightness, a quality of pleasant anticipation that seemed to be her baseline relationship with the future, rather than a response to anything specific. Emmett's was the simplest, the emotional equivalent of someone genuinely comfortable in their own skin, untroubled by complexity. Rosalie's was more guarded, her resting state carrying the familiar undercurrent of her grief even in its quietest form. He received all of this in the morning hours, the family's nighttime and early morning emotional textures arriving in his awareness with the completeness and the involuntary quality that characterized everything his gift delivered. It was not burdensome in those hours, not the way it was at school or during Bella's visits. It was simply present, the way the sounds of a familiar house are present, background rather than foreground, requiring little active management. But it was never absent. This was the thing that could not be overstated, the thing that was most difficult to communicate about his experience to anyone who did not share it. His gift did not have an off state. It did not have a low setting that could be maintained during easy periods and turned up only when the situation required. It operated continuously at the same fundamental level of reception regardless of circumstance. And what varied was not the gift's operation, but the intensity of what it was receiving. Easy periods were not periods of rest for the gift. They were periods when the incoming material was less acute, which was meaningfully different from the gift requiring less of him. He was always working. This was the reality of it, stated plainly. Every moment of every day required him to be doing something with the incoming emotional information his gift delivered. Whether that something was the intensive active management of a high-stakes situation, or the low-level continuous sorting of a quiet morning. The work was never finished because the reception was never finished, and the cumulative cost of work that never finished was something that did not fully express itself in any single day, but that accumulated across days and weeks and months and years into something that had no name because he was, as far as he knew, the only person who had needed to name it. School remained the most demanding regular feature of his existence, the environment that required the most consistent expenditure of management resources, and that provided the least relief during its duration. He had developed his strategies over years of attending, refining them as he learned more about his own gift and its specific responses to different types of emotional input. The corner seats, the edge positions, the routes through the building that minimized time in the highest traffic areas, the deliberate management of his own breathing and physical stillness as tools for reducing the overall stimulus load he was processing at any given moment. These strategies were effective. They reduced the demand to something he could sustain across a full school day. They did not eliminate it. The hallways between classes were the most intense periods, the moments when the building's entire student population was in motion simultaneously, each person carrying their particular emotional weather into the shared space at full volume. Jasper moved through these intervals with the efficiency of someone who had calculated the optimal path through a complex environment and who executed that path with the minimum deviation from it that social requirements permitted. He was not unfriendly. He was not visible in his management. He was simply, to anyone observing, a quiet and slightly reserved student who moved through the school day without particular drama. What was happening internally during those hallway intervals was something that bore no resemblance to the quiet reserve his outward presentation suggested. He was receiving continuously and without filter the emotional states of several hundred adolescents at close range, managing the most intense signals actively while allowing the lower intensity material to pass through at a level of processing that was less demanding but still present. He was also monitoring the family members around him, receiving their states as a continuous layer beneath the broader human input, noting the fluctuations in their managed thirst that proximity to the student body generated, and adding those fluctuations to his own management burden as they arrived. By the time he reached the relative refuge of a classroom and was seated with fixed neighbors rather than a moving crowd, the hallway interval had cost him something measurable in terms of the management resources he would have available for the rest of the day. He replenished these as best he could during the quieter periods, the way a person who has been required to exert sustained physical effort looks for brief opportunities to recover before the next demand. But the opportunities were never quite sufficient, and the deficit accumulated across the day, so that the final hours of school consistently required more effort than the first hours for the same level of external challenge. He never discussed this with anyone at school, and rarely at home. Alice knew the broad outlines of it, because Alice knew the broad outlines of most things about his experience, and because he had, over the years of their relationship, allowed her closer access to the specifics of his interior life than he had allowed anyone else in his existence. She received this knowledge with the characteristic combination of genuine concern and practical orientation that was her approach to most things, wanting to understand what would help and directing her attention toward the identification of things she could actually do, rather than the expression of concern that could not be acted on. He valued this about her more than he could easily say. The others knew, in the general terms that come from living closely with someone for long enough, that Jasper found certain environments more taxing than others, and that his strategies for managing those environments were not quirks of personality, but necessities. They knew this without having the full specificity of it, without understanding the precise mechanism by which a hallway full of teenagers translated into a sustained management burden that compounded across the day and the week, and accumulated across time. And he did not fully explain, because full explanation required articulating things that he had not yet found adequate language for, and because the attempt to explain sometimes produced a quality of concern in the people around him that was itself something he then had to manage. The paradox was complete, and had been complete for as long as he could remember. His gift allowed him to ease the emotional burdens of those around him, to project calm into difficult situations, to help the people he cared about access steadier ground during the moments when their own footing was uncertain. And the using of his gift in this way, the projecting outward, required him to generate or amplify the emotional state he was offering, which cost him something from his own reserves each time. The gift that helped everyone else could not help him. The one person in any room whose emotional burden was most in need of easing was the one person his gift could not reach. He was the regulation mechanism for the family's emotional environment, the person who smoothed the rough edges and dampened the acute spikes and returned the collective emotional field to something workable. And he was also the person who absorbed those rough edges and acute spikes most directly, who felt them most completely, who carried them longest. He gave out calm and received back everything else. Emmett, in the way that Emmett occasionally surprised people, had once said something to Jasper during a hunting trip that had stayed with him. They had been moving through the mountains in comfortable silence, the particular ease of two people who did not require conversation to share a space productively, when Emmett had observed without preamble that Jasper seemed like the kind of person who was always fine right up until the moment he very suddenly wasn't. He had said it without weight, in the casual way he said most things, and had moved on without waiting for a response. But Jasper had held the observation because it was accurate in a way that Emmett could not have fully understood from the outside, and because accuracy delivered without demand was something he appreciated from whatever direction it arrived. He was always fine, in the sense that fine meant functional and present and managing. He was fine in the hallways, and fine during Bella's visits, and fine in the aftermath of the birthday party. In all the ways that fine meant he was still standing and still doing what the situation required of him. The thing that Emmett's observation had touched without fully grasping was that fine and undamaged were not the same category, and that someone could sustain the former for a very long time, while the latter became increasingly theoretical. He thought about this during the quiet months of Edward's absence, not in a way that was dramatic or that produced any resolution or change in his approach, but in the way that someone thinks about a true thing that they cannot act on directly. He was carrying a great deal. He had always been carrying a great deal. The specific quantity of what he carried had increased incrementally since joining the Cullens, because a family of 6 vampires committed to a lifestyle of managed restraint generated a specific and continuous emotional burden for someone with his gift that a solitary existence or a more chaotic one would not have produced in the same form. But he had also, in that same family, found the things that made the carrying possible. Alice, whose emotional steadiness was the fixed point of his navigation. Carlyle's compassion, which arrived in his awareness every day as a reminder that the thing they were all attempting was genuinely worth the attempt. The specific, uncomplicated warmth of Esme's maternal feeling, which asked nothing of him and gave itself freely. Emmett's fundamental cheerfulness, which was not simple, but was genuine, and which contributed to the emotional weather of the house, a quality of likeness that had a real and measurable effect on what Jasper received, and therefore on what he had to manage. These were not nothing. They were, in fact, considerable. They were the things that had made the difference over years between a burden that was survivable and one that was not. He was under no illusion that the burden itself was appropriate or sustainable in any final sense. He did not expect that there would come a day when his gift stopped receiving, when the emotional input from the people around him reduced to a volume his nervous system could handle without continuous active management. That day was not coming. His gift was permanent, as his existence was permanent, and the daily cost of it was correspondingly permanent. What he had, instead of relief from the burden, was the knowledge that what he was carrying him somewhere, that the family he had found, the life he had chosen alongside Alice's certainty and Carlyle's compassion and all the rest of it, was worth the specific and daily and unrelenting cost that his gift extracted from him for the privilege of being part of it. This knowledge was not always vivid. There were days when it was more theoretical than felt, when the management work of the ordinary morning was sufficient to occupy the full range of his available resources and leave nothing remaining for perspective or gratitude or any feeling more elevated than the functional determination to continue. But it was always true, even on those days. And the truth of it, held underneath everything else, was what allowed him to walk into school the following morning and take his position at the edge of the hallway and receive, without complaint and without explanation, and without any of the people around him fully understanding what he was doing, everything that the day would send him. He stood at the edges of rooms because the edges were more manageable than the centers. He kept his distance in situations that others navigated freely because his experience of those situations was not theirs and the distance was not preference but requirement. He was quiet in the way that someone is quiet when the interior work they are doing at any given moment is too substantial to leave much room for the exterior performance of engagement. He was not weak. He had never been weak. He was someone doing something that no one around him fully understood, and doing it continuously, and doing it well enough that most of the time no one noticed it was being done at all. This was the constant war. Not the Southern Wars, not the battles with Maria's enemies, not the dramatic confrontations that history would have recognized as conflict. The constant war was this. Every morning, every hallway, every shared room, every moment of Bella's presence and its compound effect on the emotional field he inhabited. He fought it without recognition and without relief, and without the end that all wars are supposed to eventually reach. And he held, every day, in every room, at every edge he had learned to find and occupy. He held. Act 9. Outro. There is a particular kind of strength that the world does not have adequate language for, because the world tends to measure strength by what is visible, by what is declared, by the dramatic gesture and the moment of obvious courage, and the conflict that has witnesses and a clear outcome, and a story that can be told afterward in terms that other people can follow. Jasper Hale's strength was none of these things. It was the strength of someone who walked into the same room every day, knowing exactly what it would cost him, and walked in anyway. Who stood at the edges of spaces, not because he was afraid of their centers, but because the edges were where he could continue to function. And continuing to function was the commitment he had made and honored across decades without ever being fully understood for the honoring of it. He had not chosen his gift. He had not chosen the wars that shaped him or the decades of accumulated emotional weight that those wars had built into the foundation of everything that came after. He had not chosen the specific and compounding difficulty of what his gift became inside a family of 6 vampires, all managing the same deep and permanent thirst, all generating the same continuous signal that landed in him from every direction simultaneously every day without relief or interruption or the mercy of an off state that never came. What he chose was to stay. To keep trying, to walk into school on an ordinary Tuesday morning and take his position and receive whatever the day sent him and continue, without declaration or complaint, to be someone his family could rely on and his gift could not destroy. He is not the cautionary figure that the birthday party might have made him. He is not the weakest member of a family of people learning to be something better than their nature demands. He is, if the full accounting is ever done, perhaps the most extraordinary example the family has to offer of what it means to endure. Not to endure gracefully, not always. Not to endure without cost, never. But to endure completely, day after day, carrying what no one else in the room could feel, and doing the invisible work of it so thoroughly that the room simply continued, warm and functional and unaware of what it owed to the quiet figure at its edge. This was Jasper Hale, soldier, empath, The man who felt everything and said almost nothing, and held, always held, against a pressure that never fully relented. If you find yourself in a room that feels calmer than it should, steadier than the circumstances warrant, easier than the weight of what is present in it would suggest it ought to be, consider for a moment the person at the edge. Consider what they might be carrying, and consider what it means that they are still there.